My Bible is open to Ezekiel 43. Several verses there will be our text together this evening. We're going to be summarizing several chapters before we actually get into chapter 43, but that's where we're going to begin together here in just a moment. It's good to see everyone out this evening. Always a blessing from our God when we are able to be together and to worship Him, to get into His Word. I'm so glad that we get to be with one another again this evening. As we get into our lesson, we are talking about, I've called this lesson New Glory. That's a little bit of an improper name. The glory itself that we're talking about, there is nothing that is new about it. Today, in Ezekiel's time, going all the way back to Genesis 1, there's nothing new about the glory itself that we're going to be looking at. But as we get into Ezekiel 43 and we talk about the glory of the Lord filling the temple, that we find that that is something that is done anew, that His glory would fill the temple once more. And so working inside of that, we would recognize that title, New Glory. And as we think about new and get into Ezekiel itself here, I've called this little summary here to Behold the New. Now, as we get into this lesson, there is I think an important preface to our talking about these things. I'm about to take some what I think are complicated things and talk about them simply. There is more to the discussion of Ezekiel than we have the time to do this evening, or that we're really going to even get into this evening. And I'm just going to present some quick summaries here of some various chapters. And sometimes when that happens, when a complicated thing gets talked about simply, someone will take that and they'll sit down and they will study it and say, it's not really as simple as he made that sound. There's a whole lot that gets brought into this issue. And so I want to begin by saying there is a whole lot that gets brought into this issue for a number of reasons. One, sometimes when people sit down and they do that study, that they become disillusioned. They say, it's not really like the way I thought it always was. And I do want to caution against that disillusionment, as there is a simple presentation of these things going on. And if you sit down and you would study through Ezekiel and you say, that's not quite what Colton was putting forth. These two pieces aren't coming together. I would ask, let's sit down and let's talk about it. Let's dig into the book and the details that are going on there as we do once more work with a simplistic picture of what could be a very lengthy, complicated discussion. So with that, let's get into some of the summaries. Going all the way back to chapter 34, God is working this picture through Ezekiel of what the Israelites had lost, what had been taken away from them, and this projection of the future of what He is going to be giving to them to replace the thing that had been taken away from them in judgment being brought against them. So you go back to 34, and the point being made is they had lost their king. They no longer have their king and are not going to have their king. But God says that's okay. I'm going to raise up my shepherd, and you won't need that king anymore because he will lead you. He will rule you. You get into chapters 35 and 36, and you see the people had lost their inheritance, these things having been taken away from them. But when the Spirit comes, God's people are going to be able to obtain an inheritance, the promised eternal inheritance. You come into chapter 36, the people had been rebellious, but now in this new kingdom, they're not going to be a rebellious people because God is going to give them a new heart. These peoples are going to walk in God's ways. Chapter 37, the people had been cut off because of their sins. God had removed his presence from them. But now these peoples who were cut off from God, who gave them life, now God is going to give life once more, and David is going to reign as their king. We'll point out, I think we understand and know this, but to point out, not David literally, David has been dead for a long time at this point, but the Messiah, the son of David, is going to be their king. Then you come into chapters 38 and 39. Lots and lots and lots of discussion to be had on this one. We're again putting it into the summary form, where the peoples had been subject to the nations, but now God is going to stop subjecting his peoples to these nations. He's going to stand for his people, and he is going to utterly defeat the enemy. This is the chapters that would discuss Gog and Magog and getting into, I think, what's going to ultimately become the theme of this lesson, much like our study in Zechariah. I think Gog and Magog is a picture in its entirety that God would do something in the temporal, physical. A lot of historical evidence to get into Antiochus Epiphanes and everything that he's doing there. And it seems like God is looking toward that in his discussion of Gog and Magog and how he's going to protect his peoples and take care of them through all of those things. But there is a spiritual application that God is ultimately looking forward to, that he's not talking about the temporal deliverance of his people, but that he is looking at his spiritual peoples. In the latter days, Ezekiel talks about that he would protect his people. But on the whole, chapters 38 and 39, the point is simple. The people had been subjected to the nations, but now God is going to stand for his people and utterly defeat the enemy, bringing us to chapters 40 through 48. Our focus is really going to be chapter 43, or the first 10 verses or so of chapter 43. But all of chapters 40 through 48 is the temple being shown to Ezekiel. God has shown them all the things that he has taken away and then is going to restore to Israel in a spiritual way. And so we come to chapters 40 through 48, and we find the people have lost their temple. God brought judgment against them, and the temple is destroyed. And so we come to this section of Ezekiel's vision where he sees a glorious temple that is being given by God. And so as we think about this temple vision, we want to come into why this vision is given. We just said the vision of the temple starts in chapter 40. You can read chapters 40 and 41, and you're going to find Ezekiel walking around outside of the temple, going to various areas. In chapter 42, he comes inside the temple and goes into various areas, and different measurements are given for it. But as we come into chapter 43, I want to read these first 5 verses. Then he led me to the gate facing east, and behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the east. And the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And the vision I saw was just like the vision I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and just like the vision I had seen by the Kibar Canal. And I fell on my face. As the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east, the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Now, these verses are really going to become important in our next point that we do talk about the glory of the Lord filling this temple. But as we work on it in this and we talk about the purpose of this temple vision, this is a really important starting point for us that we would see in all of this temple vision. The crowning moment of it is his being taken to this eastward facing gate, and he sees the glory of the Lord come into the temple. I think that is really important for us to get a really important starting place to start to wrap our minds around some of this vision. God's glory fills up this temple. Let's then go to verse 10. As for you, Son of Man, describe to the house of Israel the temple, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and they shall measure the plan. When we talk about why this vision is given to Ezekiel, why he is shown this temple and he walks all around it, and he's taken to this place where he would see the Lord's glory fill up the temple, he says, this is the purpose. You go and you tell Israel about this temple that you have seen. You tell them about your having seen God's glory fill this temple up to this purpose, for this reason, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities. We have to ask, why does being told about this temple bring shame for their sin? There are many who are of a premillennial bent that would step into Ezekiel 40 through 48, and they say, that's instructions for the temple that is going to be built when Jesus comes back to establish his 1,000-year reign from Jerusalem. There are a number of problems with that. I think primarily as you read through the book of history, even think about Zechariah, the minor prophet, it's never, okay, they're rebuilding the temple, and they said, now what was that measurement Ezekiel gave for us in the building of the temple there? That they would never look to the physical, they never looked to this temple for a template of the physical rebuilding of the temple itself here. God is not talking about primarily about a physical temple inside of this. But we come down to the problem as well as, what would that have to do with convincing these peoples to be ashamed of their sin? Okay, a temple is built to these specs. A temple is built after the image of Ezekiel here, which you actually couldn't do because full specs aren't given in the book of Ezekiel. What would that do? To make the people ashamed of their iniquities. That's not the point. That's not what God is talking about, what many would jump into this text to see and try to argue for. That's why I opened up with those first 5 verses. As God is talking about this temple is the place of His presence. This temple is the place of His glory. And it's been taken away from them because of their sins. And so He says, you tell the people about this temple. You tell them of it and of my presence in it, so that they will be ashamed of what they have done to have had this removed from them. That's the purpose of this temple vision. Now, as we work forward here, and I hearken back to the Zechariah refrain of beginning in the temporal that God ultimately has a spiritual fulfillment for, I think we see the same thing happening here, that this is going to offer a hope to these peoples. That's part of the point of verse 10, that you tell them about this thing that's going to be hopeful to them here and now, so that they'll be ashamed of their iniquities and their relationship here and now can be reestablished with me. I'm going to be bringing my peoples back home. A temple is going to be rebuilt. Tell them about this temple, Ezekiel, so that they won't return to their former way of living and will have hearts that belong to me. So there is temporal application to what Ezekiel is doing here, but I think we would fail if we step into this text and limit it to a temporal application. So with that, let's come to God's glory in the temple. When the temple was rebuilt, when the peoples came back from Babylonian captivity, and you remember we studied about this in Zechariah and Haggai, how God had to raise up these prophets and encourage these peoples to get back to the work of rebuilding the temple. When that temple was rebuilt, it did not go quite like the first temple building with Solomon. Let's just compare the passages. If we can look in 1 Kings chapter 8 here. 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 10. And when the priest came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. That's at the building of the temple with Solomon, that his glory fills up this house, and the priest cannot stand to serve inside of it because of the strength of the presence of God's glory. Let's go to the completion of the second temple that was built after the Babylonian captivity, coming to the book of Ezra. Ezra 6, we're going to begin in verse 13 here. Ezra chapter 6, beginning in verse 13. Then, according to the word sent by Darius the king, Tatnai the governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar-bozenai and their associates did with all diligence what Darius the king had ordered. And the elders of the Jew built and prospered through all the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. They finished their building by decree of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. And the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. They offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats according to the number of the tribes of Israel. And they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their divisions for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. And then you can go on to read about the celebration of the Passover and the keeping of the feast of unleavened bread. And what you're not going to find is, and the glory of the Lord filled the house such that the priests were unable to minister, to serve inside of it. You're not going to find it. You're not going to find it in Zechariah. You're not going to find it in Haggai. You're not going to find it in the books of history. It's never recorded. It doesn't happen. God's glory does not fill this temple, at least not in this way, the way you see happening in the first temple there. Yet, Ezekiel is shown this glorious vision, an encouragement to a peoples who had lost their temple. And he says, I had this vision. This wonderful temple was shown to me, and I was taken to that eastern-facing gate, and I heard the sound of the many rushing waters, and I saw the presence of the Lord come into the temple and fill it up. Because we're never told about the glory of the Lord filling up the second temple, I do not think we can look at this and make direct application to it. But I do think there is some temporal application to be made there, where this would be an assurance to these peoples in their day and time of, you need to see the wonderful nature of what has been removed from you and strive toward that you would recognize the iniquities that took away my presence, and seeing what it would be to have a temple with God's presence, that is what you are aiming toward, that they are aiming toward this temple that would be filled with God's presence, recognizing it's not this physical temple. It's not this thing that we have built, but this is our push, our striving toward this thing that Ezekiel has seen, that we would be pleasing to God. But as we take that, I do want to come into the New Testament, because there is a sense, and I do think it is a sense. I think that there are some who would make this the fulfillment, and I believe that is a mistake as well. But there is a sense in which this secondary temple being built is filled with the glory of God. If we can head to Matthew 21 here. Matthew 21 and begin in verse 7 or verse 1. And when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent two disciples, saying to them, Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says to you, You shall say, The Lord needs them, and he will send them at once. This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. The disciples went and did as Jesus directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and followed him were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest! And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, Who is this? And the crowd said, This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. As you go back to verse 1, you see Jesus there in the Mount of Olives. And if you look up on a map where the Mount of Olives is, you're going to find that it is eastward of Jerusalem. It's just a hair northeastward of Jerusalem. But it is to the east of Jerusalem, so that when Ezekiel is taken to the eastward facing gate to look out and see the presence of the Lord coming then from the east to see. Well, the second temple has had a lot of work done on it at this point as Herod comes in and does various things in the building of the place. But to see the presence of God does come into this temple. The glory of God does come into this temple, if we can consider the Gospel of John in John 1 and verse 14. John 1 and verse 14, And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. To see the glory of the Father in the Son, and that glory comes from the east into the temple, just like Ezekiel saw. And so I do believe there is application of what happens here. Many, I think, would miss it. They wouldn't recognize it because they failed to see the glory of the Father inside the Son. But as the Son comes into the temple, again, from the east, I don't think that's an insignificant detail in Ezekiel there, that the point is made. Here comes the glory of the Father from the east to be inside of the temple. Now, there are a number who would limit their application to that. In fact, there are brethren that I highly respect them, and I highly respect their work that they have done, but they would push back on the point I'm about to make. They say there are a number who step into Ezekiel 40 and verse 48 and see the church, but that comes with some problems. And I think they're mistaken about that. I think that's what we need to be seeing in Ezekiel 43. Go back to the text with me. Ezekiel 43, and in fact, let's just go ahead and reread these first 5 verses again. Then he led me to the gate, and the gate facing east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the east, and the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And the vision I saw was just like the vision that I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and just like the vision that I had seen by the Kibar Canal. And I fell on my face as the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. While the man was standing beside me, I heard one speaking to me out of the temple, and he said, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever. And the house of Israel shall no more defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their whoring and by the dead bodies of their kings at their high places. When you look at the description of what God says this place is, it says, this is the place of my ruling. This is the place of my throne. This is the place where I will dwell with my people. This is the place that my glory will be. And the New Testament is abundantly clear on the fact that that's us. We are the temple in which God's glory dwells. Is there application to Jesus coming from the Mount of Olives and the glory of the Father literally being in the temple? Absolutely. Is that the fulfillment? Is that it? It can't be. Is there application to God's people getting to leave Babylonian captivity and rebuilding the temple, and God's presence is clearly seen with them and blessing them so that they can rebuild the temple? Absolutely. But is that it? Can't be. God is showing us a temple here where his glory dwells, and he is with his people. And unlike the teaching of the premillennialist who is still waiting for this, the New Testament teaches us that's right now, of God's glory being in the temple. We need to pick up these passages here as we talk about God dwelling with us. We'll work John 14 and verse 23. John 14 and verse 23, Jesus says, and Jesus answered him, If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. What is that picture? That's of a peoples who love God. And so from a love for God, God loves them. And that's where I'm going to come live. I'm going to come make my home with him, with her, because they love me. What about 1 Corinthians 6? 1 Corinthians 6, and we'll look at verses 19 and 20 here. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. Now, here I think is a significant point for us to see. I know and I recognize, and I need you to know and recognize, as he talks about, so glorify God in your body. He's talking about the actions that we take that would then bring glory to God. But if we are acting this way because we are a temple for God and His Holy Spirit is living within us, is that not His glory within us that is then on display as we are using this body to glorify Him because we are His temple? And His glory is to be seen in us. That's why we are to glorify Him in this body. God's glory dwells in His temple. 2 Corinthians and chapter 6 now. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 14. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you. Doesn't verse 16 sound remarkably similar to Ezekiel 43 and verse 7 as God is talking about being in the temple on the soles of His feet? And he says in 2 Corinthians here, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them. I'm going to be in their presence. I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever. How about His saying that He will be our God and we will be His people? Isn't that His throne inside of the temple, that we would be those who are under His rule? Those who would back away from this. I cannot fully comprehend the hesitancy to make this point. Again, I'm talking simply about a complicated issue. There is a whole lot more to it, and I do understand it. I think the brother who says there starts to be some complications if this would ultimately apply to the church. But I do not think that those complications are without answer. And I think it becomes abundantly clear when God talks about the glory coming into the temple, the fulfillment of it. It's right here. That's me, and that's you. That's Acts chapter 2. That is the establishment of the church. And God says, those are my people. I will dwell among them. That is my temple. That's where my glory is. And it is to be seen. And there's going to be a wonderful picture later in the book of Ezekiel where from this temple water pours forth this life-giving substance. And if we back away from the picture, I think we miss an awful lot of what God is showing us in that. As we recognize His glory within us, and that would be a showing of His glory. Which brings me back to a point that I established earlier. This would be a hope to the people of Ezekiel's day. Chapter 43 and verse 10 says, you tell them about this temple so that they will know. It's going to shame them for their sins, because they're going to know what was removed from them, that what was taken from them. That's going to make them feel shame for what it is that they have done. Again, that has very direct application to the people of God. Says you go and you tell the people of Israel this directly. This has this application to them. But I think we can take that and make application to ourselves as well. That we would see this temple. Not only see this temple prophesied, but that we would see the fulfillment of this temple, who enjoys and partakes in the very presence of God. And God says, you seeing that temple, and you would pick sin over the temple of God? Doesn't that put the shame of sin upon us? How would I pick darkness and filth? Working with the 2 Corinthians 6 text here, how would I pick fellowship with darkness and partnership with Belial over walking with God and being His temple? That puts the shame of sin upon us. That lesson that Ezekiel was to take to Israel, we bring that home. How could I pick anything else? And if I do, that there's shame. That there is how could I have abandoned the Lord my God? And so with that, we would end with 2 Corinthians 6 this evening, and we would ask about your walk with the Lord. Are you living as the temple of the living God? Or have you made your partnership with the world? Have you turned away from glorifying God in your body, that His glory would live in you, to looking like the rest of the dark world around us? If that is you this evening, won't you feel the shame? Won't you feel the weight of turning away from our God and come back to Him? If we can help you at all this evening in your walk with God, won't you come while we stand and sing the song selected? When Jesus comes to reward His servants,